Now let's get down to business and listen to today's top crime stories.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on Law&Crime.com and across the country. The attorney for convicted rapist and former Stanford University swimmer Brock Turner is trying to get his attempted rape conviction overturned. Turner's attorney argued that his client did not intend to rape the woman since he had his clothes on when he was caught. Turner was convicted of sexually assaulting an intoxicated woman after he was caught on top of the half-naked and unconscious woman by 2 Swedish graduate students. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail, which caused outrage on social media. Turner is now required to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. Authorities in Georgia are launching an investigation after video surfaced of a shirtless man hanging onto a moving car for several miles. The driver of the car, 17-year-old Viviana Deyete, claims the man came out of nowhere and jumped onto her car while screaming about being in danger. Deyete drove several miles before the shoeless man dismounted her car. The man was taken into custody, and authorities believe he was hallucinating at the time of the incident. A man in Maryland who was previously convicted for the killing of a 7-month-old son was arrested in the killing of another child. 35-year-old Francois Brown of Baltimore was charged with first-degree murder in connection to the killing of his girlfriend's 18-month-old son, Zaray Gary. The autopsy of the child showed he had a broken clavicle and internal injuries, and investigators believe Brown beat the child. Brown served nearly 3 years in prison for child abuse resulting in death for the killing of his son, Kendall Brown, in 2012. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
Thanks, as always, for that, Anthony. Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator, is live with me this afternoon via Skype. Joseph, thanks so much, as always, for joining us.
Great to be here, Stacey.
So let's just briefly talk about that last story. Just absolutely heartbreaking. This man served time for killing an 18-year-old month boy, a toddler, then was released early only to kill another child, his son. I mean, the big question here, how does someone like this get back out on the streets? I mean, he was sentenced to 14 years but was released after just about 3. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is a tragedy. Is assuming that it was a preventable event, and it draws into question the evaluations that are being conducted relative to the courts and to a greater degree within the correction system. How are these evaluations being pursued, and what kind of assessments are being turned out? You know, when you're turning somebody else loose like this that already has a proclivity for injuring and killing someone so very defenseless, and then going out and killing this other small child, it's a real head scratcher. And I hope that the authorities will take a closer look at the way they're kind of evaluating these types of people, because the thing about it is this obviously has occurred. It's a tragedy, but it leaves us to ponder: might there be others lying in wait for the same thing to happen? We've heard these stories over and over again about repeat offenders, particularly sexual predators that will go out. I don't think that homicides are much different. They just have a thirst for blood many times.
Yeah, and let me correct what I said earlier. His original conviction in 2012 was for beating his 7-month-old son to death. Then this time around, after he was released, it was his 18-month-old son. Both times, investigators found that the babies had injuries, broken bones, internal injuries. From a forensics perspective, and child abuse, I know, is sort of a crime of its own, and its own a category. But how does someone do that to a child, not just once, but twice? I mean, I know in many cases these are people who were abused in their own childhoods, who grew up seeing abuse. A lot of people grapple with this. You know, someone does this just to one kid, but then another child, and these are his own children.
Right. Well, I can tell you, as a forensics guy, I don't care what kind of abuses he suffered as a child, other than how is that going to aid me in the assistance of following through on the current events that he is inserting himself into, where he is taking the lives of these 2 precious little children. It means nothing to me. I don't care how much he suffered as a child. It's too great a price to pay. So I think again, it's something that is instigated by anger, by rage, and almost a carelessness or an apathetic view of the life of others. Obviously, he has issues relative to this. This brings us full circle back to the evaluations that the psychiatric community are conducting. We're hearing this over and over and over again, particularly when it comes to gun violence and all these sorts of things. How is this guy being released back out into the general population among us? And then, to make matters worse, he's being put into the presence of another of the most vulnerable among us. So that really draws into question not so much his behavior, probably expected. He's done it before. It draws into question the capabilities of those individuals that are conducting the evaluations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this suspect, Francois Brown, was just arrested July 20th. He's now facing first-degree murder charges, and let's hope this time, if he is convicted, he stays behind bars for a longer amount of time so he can't commit an act like this again. All right, let's move on now to the another big trial that we are following today out of Ohio. That is the case against Anthony Kirkland. He is a serial killer who has been convicted of killing 5 women. What's going on right now is that a jury will be deciding whether or not he should get death for 2 of those murders. Previously, a jury sentenced him to death for 2 of these murders. That sentence was overturned, and so now another sentencing hearing is underway. The victims here are Cassania Crawford, who was 14, and Esme Kenny, who was 13. Before we get to some of the key testimony that we heard already in this case this morning, I want to talk about the fact that the jury this morning went on a view. They went to the scene where Esme Kenny was murdered after they heard, or before rather, they heard the opening statements. The jurors actually went to the scene of the crime, even though it was, more than 10 years ago, to see this. So as for the other victim, Cassania Crawford, where her body was found, that's actually now under an area that's under construction for a highway project. So prosecutors said they couldn't take the jury there. But what is the significance, Joseph, of bringing the jury to the scene of a murder? Obviously, this was, 10 plus years ago. There's nothing to see there anymore. But what does it do to bring a jury there to the scene?
Well, it certainly makes it more tactile for the jurors. You kind of talk when you're in these kind of very austere environment within the courtroom. I don't know if austere is correct, but this very almost sterile environment of, we conjures up visions of oak paneled walls and very clean and neat. It is rather abstract in that environment when we're talking about these crime scenes in which we insert ourselves into as investigators. You take a jury back out to these areas, Stacey, and it kind of makes the crime come to life to a certain degree. And this can, in fact, be a double-edged sword. Like you mentioned, there's ongoing construction that's happening there now. So now you're having to direct a jury to recreate in their own mind what it would have looked like at that point in time. Sometimes that can be unhealthy, I think, because it leaves a lot of latitude for interpretation. In the onset, as investigators, what we need to do when I teach my students at Jacksonville State, one of the things I really emphasize to these students is the fact that not only are you going to be crime scene investigators, forensic investigators, but to a certain degree, you're historians. You're documenting those things that will forever be lost after this point. We do that photographically. We do it through videography and through sketches and all that sort of thing. It's a moment frozen in time. There is a benefit for taking juries out to the scenes. I've gone out to scenes that have been recreated. I've actually not recreated. I've been to those that have not been recreated, but we've gone back out and restaged crime scenes based upon measurements that we have, and kind of stood by. We don't, you don't say anything to the jury members. You just kind of present it. They show back up with the judge and the bailiffs in tow, and they're able to walk around the secured area and kind of take a look. But again, it is a two-edged sword, but it brings the thing back to life. I've often wondered, and I've never talked to a defense attorney about this, but I've often wondered how impactful this is for their case that they're trying to present. relative to how it's influencing the jury, the perception of what all of this is? Is it better to keep it within those hallowed halls of justice, or is it better to bring them out into the real world and let them see where this many times horrendous event took place?
Yeah, and this is near a reservoir, presumably a somewhat scenic area there. The young woman had been on a jog when she encountered Kirkland. He ended up beating her, raping her, killing her. I will be interested to see how this viewing plays into the jury's deliberations when they get to that point. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. Wow, some disturbing details we just heard from Howard Grant from the Cincinnati Police Department about the 2006 crime scene where they found the body of Cassandra Crawford. Now, it was back in 2006 when Cassandra, who was just 14, had snuck out of her family's house, but she didn't come back. She ended up encountering Anthony Kirkland, and when her remains were found, as we just heard the investigators say, they had to use dental records to identify her because her body was so badly burned. Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator, still with us via Skype. So, Joseph, forensics, this is your wheelhouse. I mean, what can you make about the crime? I mean, this is such a brutal crime when they can't even identify her body without using dental records.
Yeah, and this goes to a point that a lot of people ask. They'll say, well, when it comes to any kind of crime scene, well, why don't you look for fingerprints? Why don't you look for DNA? Why don't you, use dental impressions to determine? And that's all fine and good. And we use those things as a utility as a means to an end. But here's what the detective was referring to. In order, you notice how he made mention of contacting the family. We can get that body back to the morgue and do an exquisite dental examination, post-mortem dental examination, and note all of the malocclusions, the fillings, the caps, and all that in the positionality of the teeth. We'll even shoot post-mortem dental x-rays on an individual. But if we don't have anything that is ante-mortem, that means in life, to compare it against, it's worthless. So that's why you have to reach out. And sometimes this is very tough as an investigator because you have a list of families that have missing loved ones, and you have to run down this list. So you look at the victim that you have, you try to determine, well, what demographic would this individual fit into from an anthropomorphic standpoint? We'd look at race, we'd look at sex, all these sorts of things. And in this particular case, they had this young girl's family. He had to go to the family, and this is the way it normally happens. Look, we may have your daughter's remains. We're not really sure. Can you imagine the anxiety that creates in the family? And you say, was she ever treated by a dentist? Has she ever had a teeth cleaning, x-rays, anything? And so the family will say yes. Then you have to go out to the dentist, speak to them, and acquire those ante-mortem dental records. And then the forensic odontologist, who is a dentist that specializes in postmortem dentistry, will compare the ante-mortem records, those dental x-rays, to what we have left over. Teeth are very, very resilient, Stacey. They're quite amazing. They can sustain a tremendous amount of heat. In this particular case, it sounds as though there was not a lot of heat generated, but based upon what the detective is saying, it sounds as though that someone tended this fire for a while. People, I think they walk around and they believe that, well, yeah, if I just pour a gallon of gas on a human body and strike a match and walk away, the body will completely dissolve. That doesn't happen. Bodies take an extended period of time to be rendered down by fire, and it has to be intense fire. Wow. In this particular case, it didn't work. He found part of the remains. He even found, as he noted, these burned timbers, and that's key to this. You don't know what those timbers were used for. Were they used as a fire starter? Were they used as kindling? Were they used as ongoing fuel? There'll be evidence of that.
Yeah.
And were they there?
Joseph, you bring up two good points there. One is like the human element that people don't think about. You have to go to the family. Can you find the dent? Can you call the dentist? No one thinks about that. But that point about, people think of it, a body was burnt to death. They splashed gasoline, lit a match. Exactly what you said is what I thought. The body just burns. But no, you have to tend this fire. And clearly this was something he probably knew, right? If he's stoking this fire, of the timbers that they found, we know he had been convicted in 1987, killing and burning an ex-girlfriend. So this is someone experienced in this. Would that tell you that?
Yeah, because it goes to method, and this is something that he is obviously I guess you want to say practiced at. It's something he's attempted to do in the past. A lot of these people are doing this in order to, first off, destroy any kind of physical evidence that might be left behind, and then to throw investigators.
Joseph, let me stop you right there.
Yes,
Hold
ma'am.
that thought. We're going to pick it up right after this break. Much more on the Anthony Kirkland trial coming up right after this. All right, well, there you saw the prosecutor this morning delivering part of his closing argument, trying to hammer home why he says James Colley should get the death penalty for murdering his wife, Amanda Colley, and her best friend, Lindy Dobbins, back in August of 2015. Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator, still with me via Skype. And Joseph, the prosecutor there laying out two of the aggravating factors, mitigating circumstances, rather, in this case. He said the murders were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, and they were committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner. We heard him recount how Amanda Colley was fighting for her life. She had some defensive wounds, how these women were utterly terrified. Did he sell you?
Yeah, just the fact that he showed up with two weapons, I look at that as wanting to have a fallback plan. He came through the door with specific intent to do this, having essentially stalked this woman, making her life a living hell. If we reflect back, I think that, the defense has been grasping at straws for a while. We were warmed by the idea of having the Ambien defense some time ago, that they have nothing else to really hold on to. This guy went there specifically to take these lives. I don't know if he was impaired, at some level or not, but he was not impeded enough so that his mind wasn't clear as to what he was doing. He went there with murder in mind.
We're going to listen to what the defense have to say as they talk about that possible impairment right after we take a quick break. And remember, the jury is out right now deciding whether or not Colley should get death. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Okay, so that was the defense delivering some of their closing arguments as to why they say jurors should spare James Colley from the death penalty. They say they never disputed that Colley did the crime. It's not a whodunit, it's a howdunit. They say no, the woman did not deserve to die, but it's not up to the jurors to decide on that. It's up to them to decide whether or not James Colley should face death. So Joseph Scott Morgan still with me via Skype, a forensic death investigator. Before our last break, you were talking a little bit about how the defense is really grasping at straws here. They're trying to talk about how he was impaired. He had taken Ambien. He'd been drinking, doing drugs the night before. He was on antidepressants. At one point this morning, we heard from family members who say he was a good person. He's great with his kids. He's great with people in the neighborhood. They're also saying, he was a good father to his own children, although that's a little hard to, weigh, I guess, if you consider what they did to his mother, to their mother. What is your feeling on the defense's case here? It's an uphill battle usually in any case, especially once a defendant has already been convicted, right?
Yeah, it is. And I take exception to this idea that it's not part of the jury's job. Most certainly is. And I would also ask the question, well, if these, substances that he was imbibing in, if they so impacted his ability to make a decision as to the moral line, whether to cross to kill these people, well, how else did they negatively impact his life? What are the relationships were impacted? Can you show proof of this? Because if it applies to one area, it should apply to all areas of his life, and that's kind of what you're looking at in its sentencing phase. It's not, it's not like typically, like a trial phase. This is something completely different that many people don't get an opportunity to see many times. So I don't, who knows what juries are going to say. But I have a hard time that they're going to buy into this. It just seems rather thin to me, Stacey.
Right. I mean, and you know, it does depend on the individual jurors. The jury has to agree unanimously to this, and we don't know for sure what their feelings are on the death penalty. Joseph, is it your experience watching cases that when the death penalty is on the table, the jury tends to take a longer time, or does it just depend on a case-by-case basis, the speed at which they decide these things?
Yeah, you know, in my experience, at least, I don't ever see somebody rushing back in. I don't see juries rushing back in most of the time when it comes to death penalty cases. It seems as though that there is more of a sense of the weight of what is at hand. There's a gulf of difference between, you know, sticking somebody in a cell for the remainder of their natural life as opposed to, you know, facilitating, you know, a needle going into their arm or whatever the case might be, depending upon jurisdiction. It's different. And I think that you know, the morality of it comes into play many times. I don't think that you're human. You know, if you're not human, I should say,
Yeah.
it's going to affect, you know, the way you're going to be thinking.
Absolutely,
about it.
absolutely. Great points there. We're going to take a quick break. We'll have much more on this right after. Welcome back to Law and Crime. We have a bit of breaking news out of Florida right now. We're showing you a live picture out of the St. Johns County courtroom where it seems the jury has reached a verdict as to whether or not James Colley should get the death penalty. It's the case we have been talking about for the past half hour or so, in which we've been talking about on this network for weeks. Colley previously convicted of murdering his wife, Amanda Colley, his estranged wife, and her best friend, Lindy Dobbins, back in 2015. Let's listen in for a moment, see what the judge is saying. Actually, it seems like he is getting some paperwork. So far, the jury has not been let in, but we expect that will happen momentarily for them to deliver their verdict. Joseph Scott Morgan, forensics expert, still with us via Skype. So we were just talking about this before the break, Joseph, about, you know, what can we read in terms of when the jury takes a little time or a long time to come to a verdict? In this case, they deliberated less than 4 hours, I would say about 3.5 hours or so before reaching this verdict. What can we read into that, in your opinion?
Mighty quick turnaround, it would seem, in a death penalty phase. To me, at least, it would. And I'm no predictor. I can't handicap juries very well. I've seen them do odd things before, but that is a very, very quick turnaround. I got to tell you, Stacey, just the egregious nature of this event is shocking. It's shocking to the system as to what this guy did. And so I have to think that this has really been impactful for the jury when they have been, you know, they've viewed all of this evidence, these horrific crime scene photos, the autopsy photographs where they're seeing what he did, what horror he wrought in his path, and not to mention that one living witness. She was so impactful in this, just describing, because she's the one that could really capture the horror of that moment. You know, going back in time, taking us back.
Right, what it was like hiding behind the door. The jury is coming in, Joseph, so let's go live into the courtroom. Well, there you have it. We just heard the jury deliver their verdict. They believe that James Colley should get the death penalty for his crimes, for murdering his wife, Amanda Colley, and her best friend, Lindy Dobbins. Jurors saying that they agreed that the prosecutors had proved these aggravating factors beyond a reasonable doubt. So, Joseph, you had sort of predicted this, as a lot of our viewers had online just moments before the jury announced their verdict. So, your reaction?
Yeah, the swiftness with which this was handed down, I think that's the most telling thing. Again, I go back to my earlier comments of the fact that this is a collection of horrific crimes. I think that it shocked the conscience of the jury in light of just the life that everybody was trying to lead. You know, these people were they kept emphasizing how the wife was just trying to move on with her life, move on with life. And this guy was still trailing behind her in a horrific way, not just to die, but, you know, in life, it's a, you know, for those that have been through this sort of thing, it's a terrible way to exist. And the fact that it ended up like this, I think that it speaks volumes to the opinion that the jury rendered here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we heard from some of Amanda's family members in this sentencing phase. We heard them describe how their lives have been broken, torn apart, the lives of Amanda and James' children, their two children. We can only imagine how they're feeling now. We know some of the family members had said they hoped that Colley would be sentenced to death. I'm wondering, it was hard to see James Colley's face from our camera angle. You could sort of see the side of it at one point or another, but he didn't really seem to have too much emotion. It's not like we saw his face drop or anything like that. Did you notice anything that I may have missed, Joseph?
No, he remained kind of placid during that period of time. However, if you remember, just a little while ago, we were watching the replay of what the prosecutor was putting forth in their closing statements, and that image flashed up very quickly of the wife's body on the gurney in the morgue, and you could see he was shaken by that. He held his hand in his head, held his head in his hand, looked down, kind of covering his eyes at that moment in time, looking away. He was troubled by that, but he seemed kind of placid during this entire thing. He didn't really show or emote much. Much of a change in his affect.
Yeah, we do see some emotion from, of course, Amanda's family members. That's what you're seeing on camera now. I believe that's Amanda's parents. Earlier, we saw Amanda's sister dabbing her eyes. So we know this is an emotional time for them, and hope that it will perhaps bring them some more closure, although we know this is not the end of it, right, Joseph? First of all, there'll be a Spencer hearing where the judge will officially deliver this sentence 45 days from now. But beyond that, these death penalty cases stretch on and on for many years because of the appeals process.
Yeah, it's a cottage industry. It'll go on forever and ever, and this guy will sit in jail for a protracted period of time, unless, of course, he, waives his right to appeal. I see this thing going forward very, very slowly at a snail's pace. And also, I think that probably they're going to try to drag up this defense again relative to medications and all that sort of thing as a point of order. I don't know how much mileage they'll get out of that. Again, I felt as though that was very, very thin, just kind of representative of the fact that they were grasping at straws all along.
Yeah. Well, again, James Colley will be sentenced to death. At least that is the decision of the jury. The judge will have a Spencer hearing to formally issue that sentence in about 45 days. We're going to take a quick break. More discussion when we come back. Stay with us. Okay, well, there you just heard some testimony from Wendy Gambales. She is the girlfriend of the victim, Muhammad Knight, who was stabbed to death. And we just heard her talk about the moments when Knight was stabbed, as she was saying, with him, pleading with him to stay with her. She saw the suspect in this case, Demetrius Elder, with the knife. Joseph Scott Morgan still with me via Skype. We do appreciate it, Joseph. In a case like this, a fatal stabbing, there were multiple stab wounds. What does that crime scene look like?
It's a nightmare because of when you have an event like this. That's many times it's fueled by anger, obviously. You have what's referred to as overkill. This is a reactive event. And there's, I like to always educate and remind people about some basic forensic principles. One of the things that we teach is the idea of what's referred to as Lecard's principle. And this is a transfer principle. It states that every contact leaves a trace. And so with this, and this principle was come up with over in excess of 100 years ago, and it still applies today. So every time someone contacts a surface or another individual, it's going to leave a trace of that individual. Now we're literally awash in this blood evidence. She's describing it. It's a very ghastly scene. It's hard as an investigator to go out and kind of piece this thing back together because particularly in a very close quarters like this, in the cab of a car, and you'll have blood all over the place. Not only will there be blood on the victim's body, but the individuals that are involved in the assault will also have blood. And one of the tough things is delineating between the blood of the victim and potentially the blood of the perpetrator. Now, this is a critical piece of evidence because this can demonstrate this intimate contact that you have between these two, and you have to be able to explain, well, why would this individual's blood be on another individual? And it seems rather obvious, but as you know, Stacey, in court, things are not that simple. You have to be able to describe this down to the very jot and tittle.
Let me interrupt you there, Joseph, because there's lots more to discuss about this case. I want to hear more on your thoughts on the crime scene, but we're going to take a quick break. We will be right back with much more on the Demetrius Elder case. That was Corey McMath, a friend of the victim in this case, Muhammad Knight, describing attending to him after Knight had been stabbed, talking about some of his wounds. And just before the break, Joseph Scott Morgan and I were talking about stab wounds, what that looks like, the scene of a stabbing, murder. And you were saying it is pretty gruesome because of all of the blood, right, Joseph?
Yes, it is. And also, when you have this very intimate connection with somebody, and that is close up with an edged weapon, there's also the potential that the perpetrator will have injuries. These things are not as clean as a lot of people think. They say that on TV, they think that someone instantaneously dies, but the individual that's perpetrating that can also cut themselves, hence transferring blood from their own injury. So it's rather complex.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because the defendant in this case, and there's also another defendant who will go on trial later, the allegation here is that Armando Baptista and Demetrius Elder both killed Muhammad Knight, but they're arguing this was self-defense. While police did not find a weapon on the victim, I mean, the fact that they suffered injuries in this, can they somehow spin that to say that this was self-defense even though the victim didn't have a clear weapon?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that the defense will certainly attempt to spin this so that it appears to be defense. But you got one unarmed guy that allegedly unarmed. They haven't produced anything that would indicate that he was a threat.
Hold that thought. I want to come back to this defense argument, but again, another quick break. We will be right back after this. Welcome back, and thanks for continuing to hang out with us this afternoon here on the Law&Crime Network. We're still talking about the Demetrius Elder trial. Elder on trial for manslaughter for allegedly killing Muhammad Knight in a dispute they got into after a party. Knight was in one car with his girlfriend. Elder was in another car with another defendant in this case, Armando Baptista. When the car stopped, the men got out. There was a confrontation, an altercation. Muhammad Knight wound up dead with multiple stab wounds. Now, the defendants in this case, Demetrius Elder in this specific trial, have argued that this was self-defense. This despite the fact that police did not find a weapon on the victim here, Muhammad Knight. Now, Joseph Scott still with me, Joseph Scott Morgan rather, still with me via Skype. And just before the break, we were talking about this, and you said in a stabbing like this, when there are multiple stab wounds, it's a messy scene. There's blood all over the defendant. There's often blood and often wounds, blood all over the victim rather. There's often blood and wounds on the defendant as well. And what I had asked you is whether that can play into a self-defense theory. If they say, well, you know, he caused us to injure ourselves in this as we tried to defend ourselves. How does that work, and have you seen that work successfully?
No, well, I can't state a specific case where it's worked specifically, but I can say this. If the other individual has wounds on them, that the alleged perpetrator, then it could easily be argued that, well, this guy shows up with a knife, and we took it away from him. We were attempting to defend ourselves. We got carried away, and hence this guy wound up dead as opposed to us. It was, it was kill or be killed at that point in time. And so that's going to play into it, I would think. I would at least believe that the defense is going to try to go down this path from an evidentiary standpoint, and the evidence is going to tell the tale here, I believe.
Yeah, well, about that evidence, we have started to hear some of it in the trial, starting with Detective Hector Bertrand from the Mirabella, Florida Police Department. He took the stand. Let's go ahead and listen to some of what he had to say about this investigation and the evidence in the case. All right, well, that was some testimony from Detective Hector Bertrand from the Mirabella Police Department, who was investigating the killing of Muhammad Knight, the stabbing death for which Demetrius Elder is on trial for manslaughter. Joseph Scott Morgan still with us here. We actually just heard the detective say he did not document anything, any injuries on the victim, Mohammed Knight's hands. But you were saying to me during the break that often photographs of the victims and the assailant's hands can play an interesting part in piecing together a stabbing scene.
Yeah, it really can, because this is something that we freeze in a moment of time. You can take photographs of the hands, the backs of the hands, the arms, the face, everything to document. And keep in mind, Stacey, that forensics is a science. It's a practice of science. And we think about positive findings in this life many times. Negative findings are also as significant scientifically as positive findings. So this will lead us down another trail investigatively. The absence of any kind of injuries, this can imply any number of things as we're kind of sifting through the evidence here. And that's what they will have done, in addition to collecting the buccal mucosal swabs for DNA, blood evidence, fingerprints, palm prints, everything else that they're going to collect. They're going to examine, most detectives will have somebody examine these individuals from stem to stern.
Yeah, well, and I expect we'll hear more about the forensic evidence in this case and those details that you mentioned. In the meantime, let's listen to a little bit more from the detective. All right, well, that was more from Detective Hector Durtrand of the Mirabella Police Department testifying about his investigation into the stabbing death of Mohammed Knight. Again, this is the manslaughter trial against Demetrius Elder. The court was dark today in Florida, but it will be back tomorrow morning. And, of course, we will have that live for you on the Law and Crime Trial Network. I want to thank Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator, for being with us. Joseph, thank you, as always. Some really interesting insight on the crime scene here and several of the other cases we discussed today. So it was great and very insightful having you on, as always.
Thank you, Stacey, and thanks to all of our fans as well.
All right. We'll see you again soon, Joseph. Now some news for our viewers. In case you haven't heard, we're doing a big giveaway here on Law and Crime, something you might want to know about, especially if you are a true crime fan, which I suspect you are if you're watching us. You can win the ultimate true crime getaway, 2 tickets to CrimeCon 2019 with a hotel stay. On top of that, come and meet Dan Abrams here in New York City for a studio tour of the Law and Crime Network. You'll get 1 night of a hotel stay and a travel voucher. Check out the Big Apple. Plus, get a Creepy Crate subscription and a Kindle loaded up with true crime books from the lineup. So a great giveaway package there. It can be all yours. Go to lawandcrime.com and click on the ultimate true crime giveaway on our website. Good luck to those who enter. In the meantime, we are reaching the end of our day here. I want to thank everyone for being with us. We had a big day today. We saw James Colley get sentenced to death. Remember, on October 2nd, the judge will hold a Spencer hearing when he will decide whether or not to sign off on that death penalty officially. We will be back first thing tomorrow morning. We'll have live testimony out of Ohio in the case against Anthony Kirkland, and we'll have much more testimony from this Demetrius Elder case out of Florida. So be sure to tune in first thing tomorrow morning. Remember, we're always streaming live online and lawandcrime.com. Thanks so much for being with us today, and from all of us here at the Law and Crime Trial Network, have a great evening.